So we are about a third of the way through the college football season. As you can see from the title of the video, we are doing a college football September review. So 5 weeks in, about a third of the way through the season, we're seeing a lot of things start to take shape, especially these top 25 polls, which you may or may not agree with. Some of them are pretty good, and then some rankings are highly questionable. We're going to go through them real quick here, starting with number one, Georgia. Of course, they are defending two-time NCAA champions. And right now, Georgia's pretty interesting. So they are, of course, leading the SEC, but they haven't had the most amazing games so far. I mean, they slightly beat Auburn. They had a pretty pedestrian half against South Carolina before coming back to beat them. We're still waiting to see that very, very dominant Georgia team show up. And considering the SEC right now is just kind of really weird. I mean, you got Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, and Florida all right behind them. Bama, they're still going to be up there, despite losing that one game against Texas. There's a whole lot of weirdness going on in the SEC right now. A lot of teams, undefeated. A lot of teams just one loss, and it's just going to be kind of interesting to see how things shape up. They are the only team in the SEC in the top 10 as well. So I think Georgia right now, they'll still be there at the end of the season. But again, I don't think we've seen the absolute best from them so far.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Going from there, we have Michigan at number two, and that's an interesting one. Of course, they're 5-0. They've had a good season last year. Have had a good season this year, but it's a weird season, right? They've destroyed all their opponents, but their opponents have been East Carolina, UNLV, Bowling Green, Rutgers, and Nebraska. And they go on to play Minnesota, Indiana, Michigan State, Purdue until finally they get to Penn State, and then Maryland, and then Ohio State. So Michigan, not super out of character to have like that start of the season that almost feels a little free before they get to their tougher opponents. Not that they're doing what they should be doing, right? They've beaten each of those opponents, held them all within single digits. So good season for Michigan so far, but yeah, they're gonna float below Georgia because of the team that Georgia is. Even though we haven't seen that big Georgia team yet, but at three is somebody that Terrence and I have joked about a lot the past few years, and it's Texas. And we can finally definitely say, we said this with the Alabama game, that they are back. They are at number three, which is incredible. They've had a 5-0 start for the first time in a while, and this is the first of these top three teams that we can say they did that in an impressive way because they did knock off number 3 Alabama in week 2, and they beat number 24 Kansas. And they're last week they're going to play Oklahoma next week, so they've got some good games early on that'll help define them as they go on towards the end of the season.
Yeah, obviously Texas right now. You can debate how good Alabama is, but Texas obviously right now has the best win out of these first few teams here, especially top three. Beating Alabama, having as good of a game that they did. Quinn Ewers, he had a great performance in that one. And the game they just had against Kansas, they knocked Kansas out of the polls, but they were at 24 anyway, so a loss is probably going to take them out regardless. But yeah, they first half against Kansas, they went up and down the field. They just couldn't score. But yeah, they really showed who they were in the second half. They potted up on them. So yeah, Texas, there's not really much. There's only so much praise we can give them, but they've looked really good. And yeah, I think this is the year you can legitimately say, yeah, Texas is back. Um, we'll see how the Big 12 looks for the rest of the season. Obviously, they're leaving, so this is their last hurrah, and it's kind of funny that right now the best two teams in the Big 12 are Oklahoma and Texas, the two teams that are about to get out of there just next year. So we'll see. Especially, we'll talk about that game later this week, the Red River Showdown. That's going to be a big one. But moving on to the other Big 10 teams in the top 10, that'll be Ohio State and Penn State. They have a big matchup coming up soon in a few weeks. That one, fortunately, is going to be at noon, which if you're a West Coast fan and you want to see that game, if you're a West Coast fan that is a fan of a team that's going to be in the Big 10, you want to see these teams. That kind of sucks for you. But yeah, that's going to be a big game for sure. Ohio State, they didn't play this week. They're coming off that win against Notre Dame, last second play there. Penn State, they've been dominating pretty much everybody. They had that insane performance against Iowa, shutting them out. They got a Heisman candidate at quarterback. I think this conference, I would say, probably has the best chance of having two teams outside of the Pac-12. Only thing is the Pac-12, it seems like they're already starting to cannibalize each other pretty early on.
Yeah, going from there, kind of a different segue. We will talk about Florida State, the controversial ACC team, has had some rough wins this season. They sit at fifth between Ohio State and Penn State. It'll be interesting to see what kind of movement happens as Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan all end up playing each other. Obviously, the Ohio State Michigan game is going to be very, very late in the season, one of the last games, and that one always has a little bit of weight to it. But Florida State holding on to that top five position after hanging on against both Clemson and Boston College. Clemson maybe a little more expected. People have given Clemson some respect despite their performances, but the Boston College win was was not one that people were super impressed with. They of course don't have a whole lot going on against them in the ACC this season as they'll face off. They've already faced off against Clemson. They'll get Duke and then Miami, and there's some more going on there, but that's not the best outlook for them. But I think that after their LSU win, as long as they keep holding on, that they'll probably remain floating somewhere kind of high up there. We won't see much else from the ACC as Duke just took that loss. Notre Dame is holding on to their loss. They're still in the top 10. They're at the 10th spot, but not the best performances for the ACC there. The ACC leader actually right now, mainly due to playing an extra game, is Louisville. They're 5-0, but Louisville is number 25 in the AP top 25. So maybe they make a splash to climb up, but they've got a rough road. They actually will play a lot of those tougher ACC opponents on the way to get there. So maybe not the best outlook for them. So I think Florida State is one of those teams that I think is also going to be floating around a potential playoff push, to depend on how the end of the season goes. But they've got most of their tough opponents kind of out of the way. They're going to have to survive Duke, which I think they could do, and then Miami. And I don't know. I don't think they'll drop any of their games. The Boston College game was weird, but I think that we could see them be they're going to be probably the ACC's only chance at having a playoff berth this season. But they could mess around and slip out on that one. So
Yeah, I think because obviously since they didn't play last week, it's kind of hard to gauge. But Clemson was a good victory, but they were behind, for most of that game, and then the Boston College one. I think that's the one where people, okay, how good is Florida State really? So I think as we get deeper into the season, if they get tested a little bit more, they still the LSU win now isn't as good considering it was week one. LSU is still in the top 25 somehow at 23. Being an SEC fan, in SEC country, that is definitely SEC bias there. The SEC, they're just crowding the bottom of that top 25 there. So, I'm not putting as much stock into it anymore. LSU is a good team, but not the biggest victory for them. Now, this is where things get super interesting. I just allude to it. 7, 8, 9, Washington, Oregon, and the Trojans. Oregon and USC, they switch spots after Oregon gets another victory. They slightly defeat Colorado, who had just got thrashed by Oregon the week before. This we were talking about this a couple of episodes ago or a couple of weeks ago. In between, we were looking at Washington's schedule specifically, led by Michael Penix Jr. He is going crazy right now. I think he's literally at like 100. I think he's at 1,999 yards passing this season, which is 200 clear of the next closest passer, which would be Shedeur Sanders. He's probably at the top of the Heisman list right now, I would say. And not this weekend, but next weekend, they have a bye this week. They've got Oregon. So that's a big matchup. Fast forward a few weeks after that, they got USC. Then they've got Utah, who just fell to Oregon State. Then they got Oregon State themselves. And then they've got Washington State, who already beat Oregon State. So this is getting a little crazy already. The Pac-12, they're going to be eating on top of each other all for the rest of the season here. I mean, Oregon, they play Washington State, then Utah. A couple weeks play USC, then Oregon State as well. And then USC, they got a big one against Notre Dame. They play Utah, Oregon, Washington, of course, again. So Pac-12, they're overall looking like the best conference. But again, even though they probably have the best chance of getting two teams in, along with the Big Ten, they're just going to beat up each other so much. You might end up with a lot of these teams having, you know, two losses by the time we get to the end of the season, or if we have each team have one loss and you're trying to figure out who the heck is really the best one out of there.
Yeah, I think this one is a really is a crazy one, right? Because it comes down to like, yeah, who's who really is better? Like, how does this food chain end up fully playing out, right? You could very easily have two of these up there if we decide, well, they're really good and their only loss was to each other. And you've already have, even outside of those top three, with you mentioned some of these teams. You've got USC, Oregon, and Washington at 7, 8, and 9, and we're kind of keeping this strictly to the top 10 at the moment. But I mean, right outside of that is Washington State at 13, Oregon State at 15, of course, just lost to Washington State. And Utah plummeted to 18, which I think might have been a little harsh. And with those three teams also floating around, Oregon State and Utah kind of already taking part in some of that cannibalism, right? Washington State takes out Oregon State, then Oregon State takes out Utah, and so now they're both 1-1 in their conference, and they're kind of already setting up that hierarchy. And so I think this is just going to be one of those seasons, right? Or one of those seasons where we're going to have so much going on with these teams. I really like Washington this year. I think I would not have expected to have been seeing Washington before the season started. I wasn't tuned in enough, I guess. But Oregon and USC are also really really strong. I think these three teams are going to do a lot. It's going to be some fun football coming this season. If I was to place any type of bets, I would say that maybe USC and Washington end up being the top two. But even then, it's like just do both and get to the playoffs. How do we weight that kind of thing? So we've got a really fun season with the Pac-12, and through all that, we still have Colorado games against each of these teams. So those will get a lot of pressure, even though Colorado has had a rough 2 weeks against Oregon and USC. They're still going to face Oregon State, Washington State, and Utah before the season's over. So yeah, I think Terrence, you put it the best way. This is going to be a cannibalism conference. We're going to see a lot of stuff going down with this conference as the season goes on. That could be detrimental to the teams getting higher up because they play each other so much. But yeah, I mean, after that, we get to that kind of muddled bottom area where there's a lot of SEC. You have Alabama at 11th, and then you get Ole Miss at 16, and then Kentucky and Missouri and Tennessee and LSU back to back to back to back. So interesting seeing the LSU or seeing the SEC kind of take up so much of the bottom half this season, and the Pac-12 be a lot of the top half. I think this is a fun season. This is kind of I think what some people look for in college football, to see different teams up and around the top. Obviously, we have Georgia, Michigan, Texas, Ohio State, Florida State isn't really like that new by any means anyway either. But I think this has been a fun season, and I think that we'll be keeping a big eye on that Pac-12 race for sure.
Yeah, and just to finish out, I think a team that's probably the most interesting here is because obviously they're not in a conference, of course. They just played in the AC during COVID. That's Notre Dame. They slightly do not super impressive, but they were able to pull out the win. They lose to Ohio State there. I really have no idea what to really make of Notre Dame this season. Uh, they've got Louisville, as you mentioned, they're at the top of the conference technically right now. Then the USC matchup. I think the biggest games will be the USC one, of course, and then when they play Clemson at the beginning of November. Clemson's still a good football team, and that game against Notre Dame is always kind of a toss-up. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think they're going to be kind of a wild card there. I think it's going to be a little tough for them to get in at this point. I think they'd have USC, and USC would still have to look pretty good by the end of the season for that win to be weighed well. And depending on how good Clemson is, if they get back in the polls, I think that help them. But yeah, it's really weird for Notre Dame because obviously they're not going to be playing in the conference championship, and that's a lot of the conference championship games. It may or may not sway things. So yeah, this has been a pretty crazy season already. We're only a third of the way through, so uh, we'll do this again in a month, and we'll see where things are. But I'll imagine it will still be just as crazy.